were concentrated in just 5 sectors. And of the 1,380 crores released, 278 crores remained unutilized. The Prime Minister Internship Scheme tells a similar story. Allocation 10,831 crores. Ministry spends 526 crores in the first 9 months. This pattern is recurrent, sir. In fiscal year 25, allocations were cut after large unspent balances, with actual spending at just 680 crores. So much for creating employment when we can't even spend the money allocated for the job of creating employment. And what of gig workers, the backbone of our new economy? There is no mention of them in the budget. Their welfare has been deprioritized at a time when unrest grows over the absence of clearly defined benefits, time-bound claims and appeals mechanisms, and mandatory disclosure of work hours, earnings and deductions. This silence further weakens the gig workers' access to social security in practice. Any discourse about the workers of our country stands incomplete without a discussion about a Manrega, now replaced by the ambitious Pubg Act. It increased guaranteed work days from 100 to 125.
It's showtime.
Introduced weekly wage payments, but at the same time it hollowed out the legal employment guarantee. While Manrega was demand-driven, fully centrally funded for unskilled wages, and rooted in decentralized planning, the new Act caps central funding through state-wise normative allocations, shifts 40% of the costs, the wage costs, to most states, and allows the scheme to be paused for up to 60 days during the peak agricultural seasons, shrinking the real window of guaranteed work. Once a state's allocation is exhausted, workers' statutory right to employment effectively ends. This converts an open-ended rights-based program into a budget-restricted, centrally rationed scheme where fiscal ceilings override legal entitlements. The Pubg scheme received a massive allocation of 95,000 crores in this budget, yet it has a major overlooked flaw that also needs to be addressed as soon as possible, Madam Minister. It attempts inclusion, but perhaps unintentionally drives technological exclusion. Manrega trusted the panchayats and gram sabhas to plan work based on local needs and community strengths. But the Pubg Act mandates dashboards with GIS tools, PM Gati Shakti layers, central digital stacks. Local priorities are filtered through a Viksit Bharat National Rural Infrastructure Stack, making biometrics, geotagging, dashboards, and AI audits statutory requirements. That's for millions of tech workers. Rural workers. One tech failure will mean exclusion without appeal and work without skill considerations. Now, when you have millions struggling to find work, Mr. Chairman, the least the government can do is to ensure that they move freely across the country to seek opportunities. But here too, Mr. Chairman, we see a pattern of neglect that is as consistent as the machine. Nowhere, I might add, is this neglect of connectivity clearer than in Kerala. Despite repeated demands for new railway lines to decongest existing routes, the state finds no mention in the Finance Minister's much-touted 7 high-speed railway corridor initiative. One is compelled to ask, does strategic connectivity end where political inconvenience begins? The consequences of this neglect are borne daily by passengers and railway staff alike in my state. Chronic overcrowding has pushed passenger capacity to dangerous limits. Sanitation has visibly deteriorated. Even basic facilities remain inadequate. It's telling, Mr. Chairman, that locomotive pilots entrusted with the safety of thousands are forced to work without assured access to toilets. For passengers, the experience is no better. Overcrowded coaches, unsanitary conditions, and a steady erosion of dignity that no glossy brochure can conceal. These failures are structural, they're not incidental. The railway sanction strength across categories stands at over 2 lakhs, yet only about 1.59 lakh employees are in service. This staffing deficit compromises safety, delays operations, and stretches frontline workers beyond reasonable limits. A railway system cannot run on announcements alone. Continued underinvestment in capacity, personnel, and basic human conditions risk turning the nation's lifeline into a symbol of administrative exhaustion. And it's not just railways, Mr. Chairman. We hear of national corridors and maritime ambitions. But Vizhinjam Port, India's gateway to global trade, our only port that can host the world's largest container ships, is treated as a local afterthought, with no central support announced for the road and rail connectivity that is hampering its potential as a world-class transshipment port. Similarly, while 20 new national waterways are to be operationalized, it remains unclear how many, if any, will benefit Kerala. Ship repair ecosystems are promised in Patna and Varanasi, but not in a state with 44 rivers and a rich inland waterway network. Our coastal communities, Mr. Chairman, face the deadly peril of sea erosion that has already leached so much of our territory into the sea, but there is no money and groins so essential for coastal protection. I've been raising this repeatedly in the House over the last 15 years. The centre tells me it's a state's problem. The state says it has no money. So we continue losing our territory, our seafront, to the marauding ocean. The lives and livelihoods of our fisherfolk, mostly living below the poverty line, are apparently of no concern to our budget makers either. And if maritime connectivity disappoints, Mr. Chairman, should we rely on the air? The regional connectivity scheme, which promised to give wings to the armed Nagrik to lift aspirations off the ground, make the skies accessible to all, yet today, many of those promises lie grounded. Nearly a decade on, at least 11 airports launched under Udan have seen flights taper off or disappear altogether. Runways without aircraft, terminals without passengers, skies conspicuously empty. Last year we were promised a modified Udan with 120 new destinations and 4 crore passengers. This budget, Mr. Chairman, Udan does not even earn a mention. Not just that, a total of 81 airports owned and operated by the financial losses. Duopolies have led to declining service quality, with the Indigo fiasco exposing the vulnerabilities of our airline industry. When aviation policies cannot stay airborne beyond announcements, one must ask whether this government is still committed to democratizing the skies as it claims, or rather as the minister claimed last year. Mr. Chairman, if connectivity cannot move people physically, one would hope education might lift them socially and economically. But here too, we see a betrayal of promises. India speaks of global excellence while presiding over domestic neglect. The National Education Policy promised 6% of GDP for education. Years later, spending remains at barely 4%. With the union government contributing only 0.4% and leaving states to shoulder an unsustainable burden. The consequences are visible and damaging. Over 1.5 lakh schools lack electricity, thousands lack toilets, ramps, or basic facilities for children with disabilities, and the foundations of learning continue to crumble even as we advertise world-class universities. This neglect hits the most vulnerable the hardest. For scheduled castes, enrollment falls from 99% at the preparatory stage to 70% at the secondary level. For scheduled tribes, from 99% to just 67%. These numbers reveal a system where poverty pushes students out of classrooms and into premature work. We are told artificial intelligence will shape our future, yet only 52% of government schools have functional computers, just 58% have internet access. Where is artificial intelligence going to come to these schools? Technology without access is not transformation. It is exclusion by design. Continued underfunding paired with grand promises will not uplift our children. Discount. Mr. Chairman, if education is one pillar of development the government should care about, health is surely the other. Budgets may speak in numbers, but nations are built in flesh and blood. And any budget serious about India's economic potential must invest in human capital, because healthcare is not charity. it is foresight. Yet public health spending remains below 2% of GDP, missing even the government's own promise of 2.5% after COVID. An allocation of over 1 lakh crore to the health ministry may sound impressive, but ambition must be measured in proportion, not in numbers. The consequences are now visible beyond government hospitals. Since 2019, over 600 private hospitals have exited the Ayushman Bharat Jan Arogya Yojana, revealing the fragility of coverage without delivery. Insurance that arrives late is merely distress deferred. Meanwhile, the fundamental determinants of health, clean air, safe water, nutritious food, and mental well-being continue to deteriorate even as disputes rise and mental health indicators worsen. A nation that seeks economic greatness cannot afford to economize on the health of its people. While you propose, madam, exempting 7 additional rare disease drugs from import duties, your centers of excellence for rare diseases are few, unevenly distributed, and unable to utilize even the insufficient funds allocated, leaving thousands of patients to die every year for lack of treatment. And nowhere is this pattern of neglect more glaring than in the case of the long-promised AIMS in Kerala. First year of the NDA government, the promise was announced. The promise still remains unrealized. A state with one of the strongest public health records in the country continues to wait, while this budget, like its predecessors, offers neither clarity, nor timelines, nor urgency. 22 AIMS have been sanctioned across India, Mr. Chairman, but when it comes to Kerala, the silence is deafening. And AIMS that is not even a dot on a map is not institution building, it is institutional disregard. Kerala does not lack need, capacity, or credibility. What it lacks, it seems, is visibility in this government's priorities. Why, Mr. Chairman, is Kerala invisible to this government? I'd like to know. Equally telling is the silence on air pollution. After months of public outrage and choking headlines, the finance minister's speech found space for everything except the air we breathe. The National Clean Air Program still runs on 2009 standards, weaker than the WHO's PM 2.5 norms, even as pollution control funding has been cut from 1,300 crores to 1,091 crores this year. A budget that saves on rupees but ignores the air its citizens breathe reduces development to bad arithmetic, not good progress. Mr. Chairman, the announcement of 3 new National Institutes of Pharmaceutical Education and Research, or NIPA, raises a troubling question of balance and intent once again. I'm sorry to return to my state, but Kerala, despite one of the country's strongest public health ecosystems and a proven record in healthcare delivery, once again went unaddressed. Even as NIPAs are concentrated and clustered in northern and eastern India, and a single institute in Hyderabad is expected to serve the entire south. This imbalance is not new. I flagged it 2 years ago when I was chairman of the Standing Committee on Chemicals and Fertilizers. At a time when over 60% of India's 8,500 MSME drug units lack support to adopt even good manufacturing practices, such skewed institutional allocation risks shrinking rather than strengthening our manufacturing base. It also does little to reduce our dependence on China for nearly 2/3 of key active pharmaceutical ingredients, or to correct India's anemic R&D investment of just 0.64% of GDP, with even large pharma firms spending under 1% of net sales on their research. The result is predictable: limited innovation, continued reliance on low-cost biosimilars, and life-saving biologics priced far beyond the reach of most Indians, where public health spending remains so much below the GDP target of 2.5%. Without correcting regional imbalance and backing institutions with serious R&D support, this NIPER initiative risks sounding visionary while delivering exclusion. Now, all of these shortcomings in the sectors I've surveyed, in infrastructure, education, healthcare, might have been bearable if at least the economic burden were distributed equitably. But as per the UNDP Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, India ranks the lowest of all BRICS countries at 130. The silent shock absorbers of this economy are the middle class. They are now cracking under the strain. The symbols of success we see today, smartphones, cars, lifestyle assets, are only sustained by EMIs, Mr. Chairman, for the middle class, leaving the Aam Aadmi little room for health insurance, for savings or medical emergencies. Credit cards are once a luxury or a convenience. They've now become a lifeline. Defaults rose 28% last year to 6,742 crore rupees, not because Indian households are reckless, but because they're running out of room to breathe. With 2.9 lakh crore rupees in outstanding dues and 10.5 crore cards in circulation, borrowing has become the price of staying afloat. Even as households struggle, the tax burden has quietly shifted onwards. Personal income tax now contributes over half of all direct taxes, while the corporate share declines, as I mentioned earlier. And while last year's budget at least acknowledged middle-class housing stress through the Swami Fund, this budget offers only silence. Inflation may look subdued on paper, but for citizens, the cost of living has really been shifted. When the state fails to provide clean air, safe water, and uncontaminated food, households are forced to buy privately what should be public goods: air purifiers, water filters, basic safeguards. This burden is unequal, Mr. Chairman. The privileged can protect themselves while the poor remain exposed. A nation cannot grow by exhausting the very people who sustain it. The Aam Aadmi who are financing this government are being sent deeply troubling signals on taxation. A one-time concession allowing special economic zone manufacturing units to sell domestically at reduced duties is little more than tokenism when the SEZ ecosystem itself is collapsing, with hundreds of zones shut and employment in free fall. More disturbing still is the withdrawal of income tax exemption on disability pensions for defense personnel. This move weakens social protection for disabled veterans who've risked their lives for our country and draws an indefensible line between service-related disabilities and abdication of the state's moral duty to those who have made such sacrifices for the nation. Now, I'd like to acknowledge that amid this disaster and disorder, there has been some measure of fiscal discipline. The fiscal deficit has edged down from 4.5% to 4.4%. Minister speaks of a further reduction to 4.3%, and that sounds reassuring on paper. But I've been in this House long enough, Mr. Chairman, to remember when her predecessor, the late Arun Jaitley, as Finance Minister, set a target of 3.5%. We're nowhere near that benchmark today, yet we seem eager to applaud for settling at a much higher number. Perspective matters, sir, and without it, these figures lose their meaning, especially when they fail the only test that truly counts: whether the Aam Aadmi has more money in his pocket, whether he has wages that keep pace with prices, whether he or she has a life that is becoming easier. Fiscal prudence cannot be celebrated in isolation when household budgets remain under strain and economic security is elusive for millions. In this budget, the Union government has once again doubled down on an infrastructure-led growth strategy, raising capital expenditure to 12.2 lakh crores on the assumption that public capex will crowd in private investment and generate jobs. But this promise is yet to materialize. In fact, it hasn't materialized at all during this government's tenure. Private investment has throughout remained sluggish. Labor-intensive sectors are crowded out by capital-heavy projects. Welfare spending has been compressed, and key subsidies and social sector allocations fall short of stated goals. Has increasingly been pushed onto the states without adequate devolution of tax revenue. Meanwhile, unemployment, particularly amongst educated youth, remains distressingly high, and capacity utilization continues to remain below levels that would trigger a genuine private investment cycle. In this context, the capex-centric approach appears less like a strategy for inclusive growth and more like a gamble that ignores weak demand, joblessness, and the lived economic distress of the ordinary citizen. Mr. Chairman, no nation can develop on slogans or headlines alone. India's investment in research and development remains stuck at 0.6% of GDP. Not only below advanced economies, but even below several emerging ones. China invests about 2.4%. Brazil even over 1%. The US 3.5%. South Korea 5% of GDP. A country that aspires to be a manufacturing and knowledge powerhouse cannot afford to treat research and development as an afterthought. I would urge the Minister to elevate R&D as a national priority. Now, on urban cities, on our cities, it should be pointed out that the hesitancy in innovation is reflected in the Smart Cities mission, which has become a reminder of unfulfilled promises. A decade after Smart Cities was announced, deadlines have been repeatedly extended from June 23 to December 25. No real change on the ground. Claims of 96% completion certainly ring hollow for somebody from Thiruvananthapuram or Warangal or Silvassa or Port Blair, because they're all incomplete. Large parts of the northeast continue to lag, leaving even the Parliamentary Standing Committee unconvinced. Instead of transforming urban life, the mission has largely polished a few elite enclaves, while basic services for millions remain untouched. I can't not mention the new interim trade agreement with the United States, because that has just come out after the minister's speech. It looks less like a free trade agreement than a pre-committed purchase agreement that overturns every principle of reciprocity. How can we speak of a reciprocal tariff of 18% on one side and 0% on the other? At a time when India's total bilateral trade with the US stands at roughly 130 billion US dollars, and we have a trade surplus of only 45 billion US dollars, we have surprisingly promised to buy $500 billion worth of American goods over 5 years. This effectively converts a surplus into a long-term deficit by executive assurance rather than by market demand. No major economy has ever neutralized its own trade leverage in this manner. While the US continues to impose import tariffs of up to 18%, we have committed ourselves, apparently according to this joint statement that I've been seeing here, joint US-India statement, to impose tariffs up to 18% on Indian exports and we to slash tariffs to near zero levels, open agriculture, dilute data localization, soften intellectual property safeguards, and even redirect strategic energy imports, especially away from Russia, to meet purchase targets. And this is not strategic balancing, it is economic preemption. Parliament has neither been told how farmers, MSMEs, and domestic industry will be protected, nor why India has voluntarily surrendered its negotiating power without securing proportional market access. Without securing proportional market access or policy space in return. I know the government will say, wait for the final agreement, it's coming in mid-March, but let them be aware these concerns exist right now.